opportunities. But before we go into that, we're going to have a quick look at our top 10 news stories of the day, which should be popping up about now. And I'm going to ask each of our speakers to give their opinion on a story that jumps out at them in neon flashing lights. There is certainly no right or wrong answer. It's just whatever grabs your attention. Please can we start with Dr. Jan Bron. He's a research fellow in the for climate and environment at CAPSARC. Hi Jan, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi Michelle, thank you for hosting us. I actually saw an Arab News op-ed, time to increase the cooperation on carbon capture, utilization and storage. That is actually a very hot topic in Saudi Arabia at the moment, but also I think in the wider Gulf region, because I think that CCUS has the potential to play a key role in the reduction of emissions from the hardest to abate industry sectors like energy, cement production, metals, and also the chemical industry. And of course, the economy-wide CCUS uptake is also a key ingredient for the Gulf region's quest for a low-carbon hydrogen economy. Now, there were recently two major events that took place in which my organization, CAPSARC, was also involved in. First was a so-called Hydrogen and CCUS Technical Workshop, which is part of the Saudi Arabia-European Union Climate Dialogue, in which some of the issues were discussed, like what actually is necessary for scaling up CCUS, like, for example, a common regional understanding regarding financing practices, but also the need to start determining a value for carbon in any kind of shape or form. It was also mentioned by several representatives from the Saudi government that the government is looking into options to develop a set of standards across the CCUS value chain that is regarding capturing, the transportation, sequestration, and also the so-called utilization. The second event I just briefly want to mention was that actually took place this week here in Riyadh, was the first International Energy Forum Roundtable on carbon management technologies, which also took place in collaboration with CAPSARC, and also the launch of a study called Strategies to Scale Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, where the stakeholders discussed during this roundtable what needs fixing for large-scale deployment of CCUS project around the world, but especially in the Gulf region. And some of the issues that were mentioned is that we need more financial incentives, like, for example, tax credits, but also, for example, contracts for difference. And we also need more government support for CCUS R&D programs and initiatives, initial infrastructure development for transport and storage, managing risks in CCUS market segments like CO2 storage, but also we need more regulatory incentives like so-called emission performance standards and also obligations with CCS certificates. So those are some of the issues that were discussed and that need to be fleshed out rapidly to really scale up CCUS on the scale that is actually required.
That's great. Thank you, Jan. We are going to go into the CCUS after we've gone through these top 10 as well. So I'm going to revisit quite a few of those points. So thank you very much. And we can flesh them out a little bit further. Next up, Sumitra Saxena, a research scientist at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, of course, also known as KAUST. How are you? Thank you for joining us. And which is your top story, please?
I'm doing fantastic, Michelle. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Thank you.
Well, a lot of the stories these days are related with science and technology, research and development. So they all attract me. I browse through them. Among this list, if you see, there are several stories which talk about climate tech, green tech. Even the CCUS story is about technology in that sense. So I would pick the challenges and opportunity in climate tech. For past many years, I have been looking into the technology landscape of hydrogen value chain, ammonia value chain, including renewals and CCUS. So this subject has a lot of attraction for me. And I work with an institution which is at the forefront of research and development and demonstration of climate technologies. KAUST is actually part of many governmental initiatives, international organizations which are looking into clean technology development and the direction and the policy that is needed to guide that. So I'll talk a lot more about that. But with that note, I just want to give it back to you for now.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Like I say, we're going to try and squeeze quite a lot into what is just 25 minutes left. And I think already with what's been touched upon, we probably have about 4 hours worth that we could easily dive into and go into more detail on. Sahil Shatila, thank you very much for joining us. Sahil is the Senior Energy Specialist, Strategy, Energy Economics and Sustainability at AppCorp. Sahil, you have a very broad scope of expertise there. A lot of areas in your bucket.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me today. Well, among the list that you are sharing, of course, I want to talk about AppCorp's latest new green bond framework. As you know, this latest green bond framework comes as a result of AppCorp's strategic objective of enlarging green financing within the lending and investment portfolios, as well as to give the opportunity for sectoral and regional debt issuers to access the green energy space in MENA. This also reinforces and aligns our commitment to the ESG policy framework, which we announced the week before. As we announced, the $1 billion will be earmarked for the upcoming 2 years to be financing the eligible green assets, which I will be talking about. And the proceeds from this framework will be used to finance, refinance, and invest in existing or new projects within the green energy space in the MENA countries. So I can talk more about the categories and the assets throughout our discussion today.
Thank you very much. Right, let's get into the meat of today. So we know that we're in the era of the fourth industrial revolution. We know about digitalization, and we know how useful technologies can be and already are in some cases to delivering significant emission reductions for oil and gas companies. So for example, a great statistic from McKinsey is that $250 billion could be added up to the oil and gas industry's upstream operations by 2030 by making use of advanced connectivity, optimizing drilling and production, improving maintenance and field operations. Now, right now, I think anybody in the oil and gas industry would think $250 billion of additional capital would be very useful, considering all the pressure points that are happening. We also saw earlier this year ADNOC's Digital Command Center. They now saved $1.1 billion in business value since the inception in 2017. So the proof is very much in the pudding. The utilizing digital tools and having a strategy does truly pay off. But we also know, as much as we know that, we also know that this is far from enough, that there needs to be an accelerated approach to using digitalization and to using green technologies within the energy environment, especially oil and gas companies. And we're very much looking at their perspective today. So Jan, I'd be keen to see from your point of view, do you see enough being done? What's your overall take?
It's kind of difficult for me to assess. I mean, I see that there is that there is a need for innovation, but to be honest, I am not that well aware of the more specifics in that field.
What about you, Sumitra? Do you feel confident that enough is being done with technology in the oil and gas environment to be making the progress that needs to be done with decarbonization targets?
Well, I would like to put my own views in this regard. And I feel there is a lot more that needs to be done, but the oil industry has taken right direction, steps in right direction. There is a lot of emphasis on green and reducing carbon emissions from all over the world by all the major oil companies, which is a very good sign. Yes. However, the scale of that and the investment needed to bring our energy industry to that level where it can really practically capture all that carbon or reduce all those emissions is a long way off, in my opinion. I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia has one of the biggest and perhaps the largest green hydrogen project launched in NEOM. We all know about it, a massive investment. Now
$5 billion US, I believe.
Yeah, several projects have come in. However, even with that, we are only generating about 0.5 million tons or 0.25 to 0.5 million tons of hydrogen a year. Now, if we want to decarbonize, for example, power industry, which uses gas turbine, the estimates that we did at KAUST works out that we need about 10 million tons of hydrogen by 2030 to eliminate about 150 million tons of CO2, which is very close to Saudi Arabia's NDCs for the Paris Agreement. However, as you can see, from 0.5 to 10 million is quite a lot of order of magnitudes of difference that we need to work on. So I would like to emphasize time and again on the scale and cost of the technologies that we are using. There is a whole bunch of technologies. I call it purple haze. A lot of technologies all around us.
Purple haze. Sorry, was that purple?
Purple haze.
Purple
it's
haze.
a kind of haze. There's a famous song, Purple Haze. So from that, I have picked that expression. So this purple haze is around. There are a lot of technologies floating around, but we are not really sure about their TRL labels, technology readiness labels, and what kind of investment, what kind of after effects those we would be having. So in short, what I want to convey is there is a lot of effort from all the oil companies, and we must commend that. However, the scale it needs to be a lot more than what we have today. A lot of demonstrations and a lot of investment is needed to come and make realistic change.
Thank you. And just before we go on to the first survey question, and after that, I'm going to delve into a word that you said then, it's been mentioned 2 or 3 times so far, and that is scale, the big S word, and how that also links to CCUS. So we're going to come back to that. But just before we go to the first survey question, Sahil, I'd be keen to just have your overview of how you think the landscape's looking. We hear a lot in the headlines, some very impressive figures, some others are more worrying, as we've obviously seen with the IEA and IPCC this year. We see tech readiness figures aren't perhaps as impressive as we'd hope them to be, but there's a lot of potential still. What's your outlook?
Yeah, from a strategic perspective, we see that the energy markets are driven by 3 main forces, which will be governing the energy transition: digitalization, decarbonization, and decentralization. Of course, digitalization is important. It will drive the energy transition, but it has to go hand in hand with decarbonization and decentralization of energy systems. When talking about digitalization, this goes beyond energy companies. Basically, from tech companies to retailers to any companies, they are pledging the energy transition, they are pledging the carbon emission reductions, and they are using digitalization as a tool to achieve that. For the energy sector and the NOCs or the IOCs specifically, they are trying to diversify their portfolios. They are trying to add power and renewables to their existing conventional products. And they are using digitalization in the form, for example, of monitoring carbon emissions for ESG reporting. As you know, as more and more companies are adopting and integrating ESG in their practices, ESG, there's a lot of analytics that needs to be done, especially when it comes to reporting. It's not only enough to say that we have established an ESG policy framework. You need to implement that, you need to report on that, and you need to show the impact reporting, which needs a lot of business analytics, and that would be enhanced by digitalization.
If time allows, I'd like to come back to that and PDM, proper data management, and how that threads into all of the ESG efforts that are going on, and carbon pricing management and carbon pricing mechanisms, and how that impacts tech as well, and that carbon management technologies that were mentioned by Jan. But for now, let's bring up that first survey, please. It's a very simple question. It's very much an overview of what we're looking at. It's the recent rebound in oil prices to above $80 a barrel will slow oil majors transition to a lower carbon future. More petrodollars are coming in comparatively, and the pressure, financial pressure as well, we mentioned ESG there already, is going to be alleviated just a little bit, and perhaps some of those pen on paper signings for lower carbon projects won't be as hasty as they were before. Now, I've got my opinion on this. My opinion is disagree, but I'd be very keen to hear what yours is, Jan, and we'll wait for those answers to come through. It'll take about a minute. So while we wait, Jan, what's your opinion?
Yeah, so I would also disagree, because I think that in the long run, I think that oil majors, they understand they don't only have to compete on costs, but they also have to compete increasingly on what my other panelists talked about, decarbonization. I mean, those are, to my opinion, the key variables in the long run for becoming for becoming a competitive player in the market that's going to emerge after the whole energy transition or during the whole energy transition. And I think, for example, the whole deployment of what I mentioned earlier, for example, like CCUS, would actually allow a lot of oil exporting countries to actually optimize and also to actually monetize on their national resources, their geological storage capacities, and access to, for example, access to their vastly depleted, or access to their depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs and existing infrastructure in a much more sustainable way. So when my other panelists talked about, when he also talked about, for example, decentralization in the energy transition, you also see that we increasingly need, major oil and gas companies, because they have the skills, the know-how, and the infrastructure to actually put all of this into practice. So yeah, like, those are my thoughts on it.
No, I agree with you completely that there's already a lot of expertise and a lot of history and knowledge within the market that if they utilize it correctly, there's no reason why they can't be part of the, the tip of the spear for the energy transition as well, rather than a nemesis to it. So Jan, you and I are not in the majority. We've lost out a little bit. Most people agree. Sumitra, what do you think? Which one did you go for?
I'm going with Jan and yourself, Michelle, because I realize that there is a lot of awareness at the leadership level in industry and in governments to not to just digress from the path of decarbonization today.
Indeed, and it's something Sahil was mentioning as well, just before we went to that survey question about the change, the ESG and the analytics needed for that. And like I say, I'd like to talk about that more with big data and data management later on, but also that ESG feeds into it, Sahil. I don't know if you agree, from a reputational point of view, it's not just about the petrodollars, it's also that reputational element as well about changing and decarbonizing.
Yeah, definitely. So after the global energy reset that we've seen post by a pandemic, many companies shifted their strategic paradigms, and they reprioritized, if you want, their stakeholders, where environments and societies became a priority more than maybe shareholders or customers or business partners. But going back to the survey, I actually agree after seeing what's happening in the energy market over the past couple of weeks, and the power outages in China, the soaring and the gas shortages in the UK, I believe that the headline now is not energy transition for Europe and North America and China, but rather energy security. So I believe, I read today an article that China is trying to buy and import coal at any price just to come out of these severe power crunches. So I think that the accelerated talk and the overhype on energy transition wasn't really realistic. It was disincentivizing the oil and gas industry in many places, creating what we call the green paradox, where the oil and gas companies started to accelerate actually monetizing their oil and gas assets in fear of having them stranded later on, which backfired basically for the climate change activists. So I believe that this month was very critical, especially with the severe winter that is expected in Europe, that energy security will be a main theme that will be addressed during COP26 in line with energy transition. So energy transition will not be discussed on its own after what we have seen happening over the past couple of weeks.
And I think after the recent IPCC report that energy transition, energy security should absolutely be key. Unfortunately, I'm having a tech issue, which is the first time it's happened in a year and a half of doing these. So I'm very sorry it had to happen on your podcast. But if Irene will do me a favor, please, just while I go and fix this very, very quickly, it should take me about 30 seconds. Irene, please bring up the next survey question and I will be back very quickly. My apologies. Thank you very much, and my apologies for that disruption. So you have to forgive me, sorry for that. So survey question, well, you don't have to, I ask that you do. And so the survey question that's up: momentum from COP26 will boost the oil and gas industry's interest in using digital tools to accelerate their decarbonisation. Now, I believe Sahel was the one who mentioned COP, which is just around the corner. What are your views, Sahel? Do you see that being quite impactful?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a continuation to what I was saying, that the energy transition in line with energy security will be addressed. I think that will be the governing theme, especially with what we have been seeing over the last couple of weeks. Of course, as I said, the three forces need to go hand in hand: digitalization, decentralization, and decarbonization. There's no way that the energy transition can be achieved without having these three going hand in hand and leveraging the green technologies at hand, such as renewables, CCUS, hydrogen, green or blue hydrogen. Of course, the COP26 has to balance if you want, the concerns, or to assure the concerns of the oil and gas exporters, in order not to fall into that green paradox which I talked about.
I keep promising that we're going to head back to CCUS, and I think now is the time to get more of your views on that, and we'll come back. Okay, that's an interesting survey result. We won't go into it too much just for the sake of time, but it's certainly good to know that 69% of people are hopeful, but perhaps most interesting to know that 31% are not. So just under a third are not seeing COP26 as a trigger for change when it comes to using technologies and digitalization with decarbonisation. So that's very interesting. We'll elaborate on that in our weekly intelligence briefing, where we have survey analysis, as we won't have time to do that now. So as I promised, we're going to return to CCUS. Just a very quick overview for our listeners. So we've had quite a bit of slow progress for a little while, insufficient investment, but now interest in CCUS is really beginning to grow. There's plans for more than 30 commercial facilities announced in the last 3 years. Projects are nearing final investment decisions at a potential investment rate of $27 billion US. To give a bit of perspective, that's double the investment planned in 2017. Now, if these all come off, we're looking at around 40 million tons of CO2 captured globally. So these are the figures from the IEA last year. Of course, things are already changing, but we're seeing CCUS and CCS on the ground in the Middle East, and it's beginning to, in terms of plans and in terms of research as well, in terms of actual projects, obviously with the total number, global number not being very high, there's not a huge presence in the Middle East, but ADNOC is planning to increase its capacity to 5 million tons a year by 2030 from the current 800,000, which is from its inaugural project, which is also the world's first steel-related CCS project. So there are things happening, but I really want to return to that big S word, scale, and the fact that there still needs to be so much more done on it. We've spoken about the need for more tech readiness. We've spoken, I think it was Jan who was saying about more financial incentives, more CFDs, more tax benefits, and so on. Jan, do you want to just elaborate on how we can actually make scale a reality and really accelerate that pipeline within the next year? Because it's not just CCS or CCUS, is it? It's all the other markets that it can lead to as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, I mean, like, I've been following all of the dialogues between, on the one hand, the oil consuming countries, on the other hand, like the major oil producing countries, and there is an agreement that this is really important for any kind of carbon neutral like future. But what's now really is sort of necessary is actually to putting the right policy in place. And I already mentioned a few things, like, for example, the need for tax credit, that you would have the reductions in for example, in the tax liability of firms if they implement CCUS. But there's also a need for setting a minimum emission standard by which emitters must, for example, like abide emission performance standards. That could also be an option in some parts of the world. And also make sure that, for example, emitters or, for example, fuel suppliers are actually obligated by law to ensure a certain amount of CO2 is captured and stored. And all of these kind of sort of mechanisms should actually make CCUS economically viable, because now it doesn't have any incentive. If you have a CCUS project now, it's only because you actually want to engage in meaningful climate action. So it must be much more like a market driven, and for that you will need policy. It's as simple as that.
For that scale, there needs to be a lot more carrots involved, because not everybody is going to be proactive for environmental reasons alone, and understandably so, such as the commercial world. Sumitra, I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about CCUS. What would you add to what Jan just mentioned? And we're looking in terms of a near-term outlook. What needs to really happen in the next year or so?
Yes, so if we look at the projections of some of the major agencies, by 2040, we need to have about 300 gigawatts of electricity with CCS, and that translates to roughly 10 to 15 gigawatt every year. But we are not moving at that scale. At KAUST, we have launched a circular carbon economy initiative in consultation and collaboration with the Saudi government and the G20 partners. And we are looking into this problem quite closely. CCUS is only part of a solution of a lot of technology that are needed to come together, but of course a very important one. And specifically, we have developed a novel technology in collaboration with a United States-based company called Sustainable Energy Solutions. So we are cryogenically capturing hydrogen or freezing the carbon dioxide out from emissions of point sources currently. And at present, we are shooting for 30 tons per day, and demonstration will be held at NEOM. And the CO2 will be captured from a natural gas-fired power plant and will be used for making green fuels or the synthetic fuels. So we are plugging in.
When will you be doing the trial?
It's supposed to happen within next 2 years.
Okay.
So we are currently at the preliminary design stage, and as and when we get approval, we will head on with the detailed design space, and from there it would be about 18 months. So we are looking at very near term, 2 to 3 years, 30 tons per day, and the next stage would be somewhere 20 times of that. So we are heading.
When would you hope to do that next stage? Because that 20 times it loops back to that S word scale. So when would you hope for that second phase to come in?
Second phase, I can give you a tentative timeline in the vicinity of 2024-25. However, things can change, as you know, but roughly that time. Yeah.
Okay, so that's quite soon. So by 2024/5, we're looking at 20 times that initial 30 being in operation.
Right.
Okay, and that will be based at NEOM, or just using those just the trial there?
So initial project that we are working is with NEOM, and the application can be anywhere in the cement industry, in power plant, and anywhere. And I just want to highlight one more fact, that we can do direct air capture with the same technology. If we can get renewable energy to run our system, so we can do DAC with that. So that's where the question of scale and all that comes into picture. Yeah,
that certainly sounds very promising, and I hope that you'd be able to join us again, maybe in 6 months to a year, and we can find out more about that project, or even beforehand if progress, because that's certainly a good project to watch. Just with my eye on the clock, I want to just go to Sahel. You mentioned earlier at the beginning, and I said I would loop back to you. The APICorp is planning to invest $1 billion in green energy projects and sustainable energy companies in the MENA in the next 2 years, and that's quite a hefty amount of cash, really. Looking at green technologies specifically, what will be the focus there?
Well, the Green Bond Framework defines eligible green assets that fall within this framework. Actually, we have 3 broad categories. First, renewables. So the project has to be either solar, utility scale, or rooftop. Wind, we're talking onshore, offshore wind, and electrical storage solutions. basically any renewable project with a carbon intensity emissions of less than 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The second category is pollution control and prevention. So any project that falls within the realm of waste collection, treatment, recycling, and composting. The third category are green buildings. So basically new or renovated or retrofitted buildings that meet a certain threshold of energy conservation or energy efficiency measures as per international environmental standards. And we have a list of exclusions also that do not qualify to this one framework. Basically any power generation facility that is based on nuclear, coal, fossil fuels, any upstream oil and gas activities, landfill operations with incineration of unsorted waste, etc., and so forth. So basically, we define the eligible green assets within these three categories.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry. May I just like make one remark, because I'm just very interested in like what you're doing like over at Apicorp. You were talking about ESG impact of your investments, but what I wanted to point out, and also in the context of the upcoming COP, is that if you look at the current ESG landscape, there are about 600 different ESG ratings and ranking services available, and that the major disclosure of data by companies is currently very inconsistent across entities and across sectors and regions, because there are really major differences between the scope of what is reported, how the metrics are measured, and how the ratings are developed. And I think that governments should support and also adopt, like national legislation or a much more unitary reporting system that is much more consistent across borders. I think in the context of the COP, I just wanted to bring this up because you hear this word ESG a lot. But if you think about what's behind it, it's a very inconsistent landscape still, and that still needs to be, made much more consistent across borders.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jan, because actually, after a quick question I had about carbon pricing, that was the next thing I was going to visit before we were forced to wrap up. Sahil, would you like to elaborate? Oh, sorry, Sumitra, would you like to elaborate on that, or Sahil?
Well, carbon pricing.
Carbon pricing, what I feel about
on Jan's comment about essentially the way that ESG analytics and measuring and so on right now is so fractured, and how can we really how can we establish some level of harmonization so that there are less black spots, so that there is less risk of greenwashing and so on, Jan, if I understood correctly. So I think that's a really interesting point on how to harmonize the analytics and how to use data to do that as well.
Yes, so I come from a technology standpoint, so I can tell that the standards should be very uniform across all the countries, all the industries, how we measure how much carbon credits are being generated, where we are saving carbons, where we are emitting carbon. And some of this has been highlighted in the study that got published in the digest you mentioned, where a company sold 100% carbon-free oil to India, and I think those things should be looked at very carefully.
Yeah.
And so I agree with the end. The standardization of all the processes, all the cost involved, and all the energy that is being used, emissions that are being emitted. It needs to be done on a very scientific and very matured manner before we can take a policy call on that.
I mean, really, it's ABCs, isn't it? Standardization. We talk about this in every single walk of life, how it improves monitoring, how it improves effectiveness as well. And it just seems that with this, as with so many other parts of the energy markets and the evolution, that it's been so rapid, and that finding that level of cohesion, especially on a global basis for such a complex industry, has just been a task too far. Jan, does that answer your question? Would you like to?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's still. I mean, it seems to be very logical, but it's still quite difficult to actually like establish this, because there are very different approaches between regions, and also between certain kind of situations, whether you're an oil importer or you're an oil exporter, or you want to like whatever. So I think one of the major tests
as well.
Yes, of course, yes, that's also very important. So I think what is really required here is what I would call is that there's a need for an enhanced dialogue and also like an enhanced cooperation between, on the one hand, producer and on the other hand, consuming countries. One, for example, neutral platforms like the International Energy Forum, and also supported by a whole range of organizations such as our own CAPSARC.
Indeed. Well, we can't go into too much more detail about some of the areas I wanted to discuss, and that there are quite a few because, like I said at the beginning, each of you brought up so many interesting points. But I would like to have just a quick survey question. It's not a formal one. I'll just ask the question, and and if you can just give a yes, a no, or a maybe in your response. And I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on this. And then, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. So the question is: will carbon price what impact would meaningful progress on carbon pricing mechanisms on a global basis will dramatically increase oil and gas companies' appetite for digitalization? If they have those price markers for the broader market when it comes to the energy transition, they'll feel a lot more confident about investing in digitalization in a much bigger way. So the only responses available are yes, no, and maybe. So if you could just stick to those. Sorry, it's so curt. Sumitra, what are you? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
Jan?
Yes.
Sahil?
Definitely yes.
Definitely yes. Great. Well, that's good to know, and let's hope that it does actually come through at COP. So if they have those sorts of signals, meaningful project. I've been looking at the carbon pricing markets for about 14 years now, and it's only really, I think we had 2 carbon pricing mechanisms in 1990. Now we've got about 64. These are according to the World Bank. So progress is being made, but considering how instrumental they are and the impact that they can have in giving confidence and goalposts to investors and governments, we're still quite a long way off where we need to be. So I very much hope, along with everybody else, I'm sure, that meaningful progress is made in November. Thank you very much, Sumitra. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Sahil, for joining me. And we've run over because there's just been so much to say. We've run over by 10 minutes. So I do hope you'll join us, all of you will join us again, and we can dive into this a little bit further.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.